webinar run by Landor LINKS, the team that also brings you Local Transport Today magazine, Parking Review and Transport Extra, plus a portfolio of leading conferences and seminars. I'm Daniel Simpson, the Commercial Director at Landor LINKS, and I'm hosting today's 60-minute broadcast titled Delivering Zero Carbon Roads in London by 2030. Today's session will focus on the London Cycle Campaign's recent Climate Safe Streets report, and our speakers will provide further details over the next hour. Speakers include Fran Graham, Campaigns Coordinator at the London Cycling Campaign, John Dales, LTT columnist and Director at Urban Movement, and finally, Simon Munk, also from the London Cycling Campaign, and speaking alongside him, a man who needs absolutely no introduction, Brian Deegan. Each of the speakers will present their slides, and we should have around 20 minutes for a Q&A towards the end of the stream. Please ask questions via the chat option on your webcast browser. You'll see a chat box at the bottom there. Or alternatively, you can email them to me, daniel@landor.co.uk. You can also comment on Twitter using the hashtag ClimateSafeStreets, but please do flag up who the question is directed at. We'll try and get through as many as we can, although the panelists have agreed to answer questions after the broadcast, so don't be too disappointed if your question isn't answered in the next hour. We will endeavour to get back to you as soon as possible. There's been a huge amount of interest in today's webinar. There's, last time I checked, there was nearly 600 registrations, and just looking at the lobby now, we're close to 400 live online, and that number seems to be going up. So hello and welcome. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our first speaker, Fran Graham from the London Cycling Campaign. Fran, take it away.
Thank you. Hello, good morning, everyone. So yes, I'm Fran. I'm the campaigns coordinator at the London Cycling Campaign. Just a little bit about LCC. We're a membership-based organisation, and we work to ensure that everyone who wants to cycle in London can. We've also got local groups in nearly every borough. They're expert local campaigners who support all the work that we do and are absolutely brilliant. So I always like picking them up when I talk. As a campaigning organisation, sorry about that. So as a campaigning organisation, mayoral elections in London are a pretty big deal for us. They're a real opportunity for us as an organisation to push for change, and it's something we've been doing successfully for a number of years now. In 2012, we ran our Love London Go Dutch campaign, pushing for Dutch-style infrastructure in London, which resulted in the Cycle Superhighways and Mini Holland programme. And in 2016, we ran Sign for Cycling, which won commitments out of all of the major candidates to triple the length of protected tracks on main roads, provide funding for Mini Holland in every borough, and make direct vision lorries the norm. We've just done a bit of analysis for Sadiq, the end of Sadiq's term, and we think he's done pretty well on most of those things. He's tripled the length. We've got the Livable Neighbourhood programme, which is the evolution of the Mini Holland, and we've got a new direct vision standard coming in. So the election campaigns that we run do have a significant impact on London's roads, but also around the conversations that we have as transport professionals as well. So when we started to look at what would have been next month's election, mayoral election, as an organisation, we turned our focus to the climate emergency. My slide shows at the moment, for those who haven't seen it, a colour graph of the average temperatures over the last years, and you can see it getting warmer. We're an organisation that was born out of the environmental movement 40 years ago, so to start talking about climate change and the climate emergency is not a massive leap for us. It's a reason why most of the people, a lot of people cycle, and we know that action on cycling equals action on climate, so not a big leap for us. In 2018, the IPCC also produced a report which essentially said that we have about 10 years to avoid locking in over 1.5 degrees warming and all the horrific impacts that come with that kind of warming. So for us, this was a time to ask, to have a big ask on the climate, and what we settled on was decarbonising London's roads by 2030. So in the next 10 years, we would remove carbon from the road transport system in London. We wanted to ensure with this ask, it's a big ask, it's an ambitious ask, but we wanted to make sure that we had the backing for this ask, the intellectual standing behind it. And it's why we asked Urban Movement to come in and help us write the report we're talking about today, which is our Climate Safe Streets report. It sets out the need for change, and it shows that with enough political will, it's not only achievable, but it will radically transform London for the better. I'll let the others cover some of the detail of the report later on, but I wanted to talk about why road transport emissions needed tackling in London. So the picture in London reflects the national one. So road transport accounts for about 20% of the total carbon emissions, but unlike other sectors in the UK, it's failed to achieve any significant reductions in emissions. So despite the improvements in efficiency of vehicles, we're still not seeing any major reductions in emissions overall. For London, the roads are also a place where the mayor and borough councils have significant levers of control. They have less so over food, for instance, which is another significant emissions area. And as a global megacity, London has a responsibility, but also a really big opportunity to lead the way on this kind of stuff. But we know that within this opportunity, we have to talk about using cars less. Many of you will have seen that last week the Department for Transport released their information about their upcoming decarbonising transport plan. It specifically mentions using cars less, which is a pretty big deal, despite the fact that its overall target is 2050, which we think is far too late. So this is the direction of travel we're in at the moment. We're in a place where the car can no longer be king. In a zero carbon world, private cars don't fit. Far too many are still placing all of their eggs in the electric vehicle basket as a solution to the climate emergency. As a way that we can decarbonise our road systems is to shift everyone onto an electric vehicle. However, the Committee on Climate Change did some provisional work on this and found that even if all new cars were low emission electric vehicles by 2030, we'd still need a nearly 60% reduction in mileage to meet a well below 2 degrees pathway. So even if we had a massive push on electric vehicles, we still need to talk about mile reduction. We cannot keep using cars the way we're using them. On top of that, you also have all of the other issues to do with electric cars. So there's still air pollution by the brake and tyre wear, there's still congestion, there's still road danger, there's the embedded carbon in producing the electric vehicles and the resource scarcity of the materials needed. They're not the silver bullet. They will have to be part of the mix, we believe, but we also need to ensure that we have a radical shift in how we move around our city alongside. So, before I hand over to John, I just wanted to say a little bit about why we've put this report out now. So, obviously, we've been planning on putting this out to run alongside our mayoral election campaign. We are currently in unprecedented times, and the election has been delayed until next year. So we had an opportunity to go back and reformat the report and put it out next year in line with our campaign next year. However, while we are dealing with this COVID crisis, and while the quite rightly the borough councils, the mayor, the national government are wholly focused on that. We still have a year, and the climate crisis hasn't dissipated over that year. And we wanted to have a space where we can start having the conversations about the kind of London that we want to come out of this crisis. We wanted to have a space to where we could talk to the kind of audience that is on this call, our colleagues within the transport sector, activists across the city, people who have an interest in this. We wanted to have a conversation. We wanted to say, this is still a timely and important report. This is still a timely and important conversation to have. And it's one that won't wait a year, unfortunately. So I'll now pass over to John so he can give you a bit more information about the contents of the report.
Thanks, Fran. Good morning, everyone. I won't spend any more time on who I am. You can find out if you want, if you don't already know. What I want to do really is talk you through three related sections of the report, and in each case, as indeed with the whole thing, I urge you to read it as well. I'm conscious it's quite a long report. That's partly because it's beautifully set out, so the text is nicely spaced. So there's lots of pages, not a huge amount to read, but perhaps one of the things to really look at if you want to under any given section. There are lots of references to different reports and other commentary that we've referenced in this. And so what I want to do is just to take you through three sections, which I urge you to read at your leisure. The first section is just a couple of pages on a vision. It's pages 18 and 19 of the document. And it's just trying to conjure up the thoughts of what our streets, London streets, to be honest, any other city centre street could look like in 10 years' time, and perhaps should look like as well, and should feel like, should sound like. The picture on the screen at the moment is actually of Potterstraat in Utrecht. I was hoping to go there in a couple of months, but that will be delayed. The last time over there, when I took this photograph with a few friends, some people on the call might recognise the back of their heads. This is 2013, and the reason I've just popped up this photograph to go along with our sense of vision is that this particular street seems to me to represent a number of the features that we're looking for. It's well bussed, it's well cycled, it has generous footways, and yet it's in the middle of a city where lots is going on. There even have trees down there and so forth. If you read the rather, you might consider it to be rather idealistic vision statement we prepared, it's talking about a street that could look something like this. It's not perfect, almost no street could ever be that, because what you want from it, what I want from it, changes almost by moment. But it's the kind of character of the streets we need if they're to be climate safe, where it's really easy to get the bus, to walk, to cycle, and to enjoy these streets and be out and about in. So I commend that sort of vision section to you, and it's just that idea of this is what we're trying to create. Lots of technical things will need to happen there, but let's have that clear vision of the kind of street environment that we're looking for. Another reflection of that is, I don't know if you've seen this on social media in the last couple of days. Some of you may recognize it instantly, others may need a bit of introduction. It's the famous Beatles zebra crossing at Abbey Road. And the reason I pointed this out is it's so well used and so well visited, it's actually quite hard to maintain. But under the current conditions, they found that this was a really good opportunity. So one of the minor silver linings of the current crisis is that this zebra crossing can get repainted. The idea that actually when our streets are quieter, it's easy to do a lot more in them. When they are less filled with motor traffic that create the danger and pollution and so forth, then it's easy to do that. There's obviously also an issue about reallocating space from general traffic when we have these other things. So read that vision and just see if that helps you conjure up a thought about how the future would be that puts into context all the technical elements that we'll need as well. The next section I want to introduce you to is section 8 of the report, which is on pages 35 to 37. And what this tries to explain is how climate safe streets bring with them a huge number of additional benefits, in addition to simply reducing emissions. That's a very big simply, of course, but there are so many other reasons. And you think, well, why wouldn't we do this? The final thing I will talk about tries to bring that all together, because there's a great story here. People can be climate skeptics if they wish. Some people are, and you think, well, okay, whatever you think about how effective that is, why wouldn't you also want this, 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 and this? One of the issues of the 7 we cover in this document, there may be others you could think of, but the 7 we cover in this section 8 of the report are better public health. We're quite familiar with that. There's Lucy Saunders' Healthy Streets logo. The idea that enabling people to exercise every day in clean air without realizing they're exercising as well is extremely worthwhile. I was part of a rather disappointing public health exercise a few years ago that the previous mayor organized, and there was this talk about how it's difficult to get to people. You know, they have to, in terms of public health, they have to sign up, go to a clinic, do this, do that, sometimes pay money to join a club. But if you enable them to walk and cycle more, and that could be walking and cycling to get to public transport as well, it's happening in plain sight without anybody thinking about it. As for fairer mobility, the issue there is that transport is a real social justice issue. The fact is, in London and in many cities, most people, even if they have a car in the household, and even if they aspire to have a car in the household, simply do not have and are unlikely to have access to a car. Therefore, all the pushback that we get from people who are worried about where they'll be able to walk, where they'll be able to drive, it might take a little longer, where they might be able to park, that is statistically a real minority, and it's essential that we focus on the needs of the often the very quiet minority as well. It's a real transport justice issue. It's also a just transition issue. This is a bit of a jargon phrase, but what it's talking about is there's obviously, even if you were the best person in the world, you couldn't just shut down the arms industry tomorrow if you had all that power, because there would be a real issue about, for example, where are the jobs around the country. And there's obviously a real transition there for lots of jobs related to how we currently travel. If we want to travel differently, that's quite a scary thought. Well, there is, and there are some good references in this report, links to a lot of evidence that talks about the job opportunities that will come from different economies, from low carbon economies, and of course, the better access to those existing and to new jobs that will be enabled, especially for people who don't have cars, if we focus on promoting the non-car modes. We probably don't need, most of the people on this webinar, I imagine, don't need too much from me on the direct economic benefits. Simple to say that the facts are that non-car modes sustain our high streets and town centres. Individual businesses might not know that, individuals might choose to not know this, but non-car modes are essential to the future of the high street, and we can build those. That is one of the best ways of supporting local businesses. There's obviously more than just local retail businesses and so forth, but there is a wealth of evidence to suggest that actually being able to travel, enabling travel, more travel by low carbon modes is good for the economy. On the better quality of life, I've chosen these famous diagrams from Donald Appleyard that talks about social interaction, just how people are able to engage more with their neighbours when there's less traffic on it. That's a little bit of an unfortunate, or it's worth reflecting upon these diagrams in the context of social distancing and so forth. But the fact is that climate safe streets will enable people to enjoy their lives much more. One of my favourite bits of evidence in this respect was actually just a pure anecdote from some work that was done a few years ago on home zones, where a woman said, "Oh, I love what you've done here. It used to take me 10 minutes to walk to the shops, and now it takes me 20. And it took more time because she got to stop and speak to her neighbours. The first mover advantage is something that cities like London should regard as being really important. It's that idea of making sure that they are leading the way. And there's a real, in a sense, there's an opportunity here in turning to climate safe streets that London's economy, the city's economy, can't afford to pass by. And finally, the policy coherence one sounds a little dull perhaps. But actually it's perhaps one of the most important additional benefits, which is when we are able to focus clearly, as we're doing at the moment, focus clearly on a particular challenge, in this case at the moment COVID-19, but if we were to focus more clearly on the climate, then everything comes together. I wrote this article in LTT last time, when is the emergency not an emergency? Of course, it's when it's a climate emergency, and the number of people who've declared but done nothing about it, that should be antithetical to our approach. There is an emergency. Let's get all our core services working together. What are our existing plans and programs? You don't have to rip them up, but what are our existing plans and programs do we really need to put on the front burner, to expedite, to do quickly, to get together? There's a real opportunity here for this to bring it together, because, and I love the fact that it's this title on a government website, because Sir James Bevan, the chief exec of the Environment Agency, gave her an address that's reported on the government website. It's the climate emergency, stupid. That should be a real focus for Endeavour. The final part I want you to turn to is this one at the end of the document, section 10, called Londoners Deserve Better. And the simple fact is that this is picking up what I've just said. What we're talking about here is good for everyone. We're so used to images like this idea of noisy minorities talking down things because it's a change. And what we need to learn is that actually there's a lot better. We have to get much better. And I'm glad to say that Simon, who you're about to hear from the LCC, is working on a project which we're helping with, to think about how just doing engagement differently. Far often we present a thing and we get the usual suspects, like I've just shown you, saying the usual things. If it's better like we think we are, and like we know it is, if it's better in all those other ways as well as for the climate, why wouldn't we do that? Let's find out, like these images from Waltham Forest Show, let's find out where people are at, what they think, where they're itching, so to speak, so we can scratch. What are their issues? Let's find it out beforehand, not dump something on them where people naturally, instinctively don't think about what might be better, but what they might lose. Let's talk more about, let's do our groundwork before we develop schemes, so that we can sell this idea of it being better. I love this slide. I'm sure you've seen it before, because it is better. Just imagine we do all this and there wasn't any climate change. It's still better. And we have to get better at engaging with people about how things can improve. We are all in this together, and we're used to thinking about this adversarially. Let's start talking about how this can be better for all and bringing people with us. I don't always like to use images from Sky TV, but this is my last one. And what people often struggle with is to believe that this can be better. Let's start working at how we start our engagement processes on these things in such a way. Thank you. I'll just hand you over to Simon, to Brian now.
So I guess this is the opportunity for me to introduce myself and also Brian. As said at the start, Brian really doesn't need much introduction, but I'm going to give him one anyway, whether he likes it or not. The doyen of cycling and walking at TfL is now one of the key designers on the Manchester B lines, Greater Manchester B lines schemes, and an all-round superstar of active travel. I'm the infrastructure campaigner at London Cycling Campaign, and prior to that I was a campaigner for many years in Waltham Forest, so I was very heavily involved in the Waltham Forest Mini Holland fact that I continually trumpet on about. So hopefully I've got mouse control. I don't appear to have mouse control.
Click the screen first.
Aye, thank you very much. Things will go much better if I listen to my instructions. So I'm also, as well as being the infrastructure campaigner, a massive old school hip hop head. So I couldn't really avoid this. This is, for those who don't know, De La Soul's 3 Feet High and Rising, and on that album, that seminal album, was 3 is the magic number, and 3 is the magic number for the key recommendations. Brian and I are going to kind of tag team across 8 recommendations that the report makes. Brian will cover the why and the how, and I will cover the what and the when for each of these. And really, we'll start with the 3 central recommendations of the report. These 3 are interlinked. Now, all of the recommendations really are absolutely necessary, and probably more, frankly, on top, are necessary to achieve zero carbon roads by 2030. But these are the kind of the big 8, and of the big 8, the 3 in the middle are the ones that are most interlinked. So if we don't get people on bikes, we will fail to get mode shift fundamentally. We can't build bus networks at the incredible rate we can build cycle networks. We can't shift people onto walking to the rate that we can onto cycling, in terms of the potential for walking is already much higher, more close to being fulfilled. So we need to get people cycling, and the cycle network is key for that. We need smart road user charging, because if we don't deliver smart road user charging, we will not reduce the number of motor vehicles, and the number of motor vehicles on our roads is such a barrier to achieving more buses, more cycling, more walking, more anything else really. So we need people to not use their cars if they don't have to, and that creates space for other modes. And we also need low carbon shared mobility, which is the third of the magic three, because that will break the kind of connection with the private motor car and persuade people to get about by other modes. So all of these three together are the first three we're going to talk about, and I'm going to hand over to Brian now to talk about the why and how of cycling.
Thanks, Simon. Yeah, I'm really going to talk about the evidence supporting the why. There's lots of references, as John said in the report, but I'm going to pick out some of my favourites as we go through here that really help state the case. So, in the first case on the why, when it comes to cycling, I've shown a report there in the bottom right from the European Cycling Federation on quantifying the CO2 embedded in different transport modes, and surprise, surprise, cycling does quite well. At the point of use, there's no emissions from it, but there is emissions in CO2 as part of the manufacture of it, and they quantified this in the report. And also there's the theory, and it's true in my case, that cyclists eat more. So a cyclist, 21 grams of CO2 per kilometre as they travel along. 16 of those extra grams is food. We'll say cars, no extra food required, but that's still 271 grams of CO2 per car, of CO2 per kilometre in there. So that's 13 times higher in there. So if you just remember that one stat, that's the way to start on this one in there. And in terms of the how, I've referenced the report that Urban Movement did when I was at TfL, the International Cycling Infrastructure Best Practice Report, and it does Seville as a case study in there. I think what I like about Seville in terms of the how is that they had a mayor who just decided to do it, and then it just rolled out in 2 or 3 years 60 miles of cycle infrastructure. At one point they were doing 400 meters a week, and I don't see what's holding us back in London there. So I'll pass over to Simon again to tell us what we should do.
So this, as hopefully many of you know, is what's called the Strategic Cycling Network, or it comes from a document from TfL called the Strategic Cycling Analysis. Nationally, we have a thing called the Propensity to Cycle tool, which is fairly similar, but this is TfL's big data crunching kind of where there is the potential to most easily shift car journeys that are currently made over to bike journeys that are currently made. The blue lines that you could probably see are the lines of things that are either already planned in or done, and the red and orange and pink lines are the ones that are yet to be done. And they're kind of point-to-point measures of potential, with the dark red ones being the highest potential. Now, the current plan for TfL is for this to be done by 2041. And when that's done, 70% of Londoners will be living within 400 metres of one of these routes. And at that point, you have a network. You have what Seville have done, essentially, which is to say, you can come out your front door, and fairly soon you'll be on a route that feels fairly comfortable and safe, and it will take you roughly, via all the connections of the network, to somewhere you want to go at the end. And that does seem to be very strongly what's needed to get loads of people out on bikes. Now, we think that 2041, obviously for the whole network, and even only then 70% of people living close to one of these routes, is nowhere near fast enough, particularly now that the London Mayor has not only declared a climate emergency, but has also said if he's re-elected, for instance, he will do 2030. So we need to accelerate this. Our view is we need half of this all done by 2024, i.e. in the next 4 years, and the rest done by 2028. On top of that, we need to start filling in the gaps. The Dutch plan not for a 400-meter distance, that means an 800-meter grid of routes. They plan for things like 200-meter grids down in their dense inner city cores. And so we need to start filling in a lot of the missing gaps between these corridors identified before 2030. We also need to look at areas where there is no potential currently existing for cycling because there is no option to cycle. We're talking about bridges across rivers, we're talking about tracks across train lines. There is lots of severance in London that needs to be considered and dealt with to create potential where there isn't any. We also need to improve this network because currently this is all based off data that's around kind of commuting and longer journeys. It doesn't capture people riding their kids to school. It doesn't capture people riding to the shops. So we need to start looking at those shorter everyday journeys and how that builds into the network as well. And finally, TfL's current quality criteria is way below where the Dutch would put it. It's way below, in fact, even where the DfT looked likely to put it. So the trigger for where you need cycle tracks before, rather than quiet roads, what a quiet road is considered as, and whether, for instance, canals are acceptable despite the isolation and crime issues associated with them in London, certainly. These things need to be fixed as well for this all to work together. Now, back over to Brian to talk about, I think, shared mobility.
Yeah, so certainly cycling is a large part of the story in there, and we had to start with that one, but they're kind of in order of priority as well, and there are so many wins with that. But onto scooters, I'm not sure whether the slide's going to move, but I'll start talking about it anyway. There we go. Oh, steady. There we go. So yeah, I wanted to reference the report on the right. There's certainly quite a few negative comments about scooters and e-scooters in there, and should we use them, and will they litter the pavement, and are they a nuisance? And for me, that's down to poor management. But I reference this report in there because one, scooters are fun. I will say, and we should never forget that one in there. But also from this report in there from Portland, Oregon, and they did a survey and asked people who were using them, and 35% of the residents that they surveyed said if there wasn't that e-bike or e-scooter there available, then he would have used a car. And for residents, for visitors, it went even higher. 48% of visitors said if it wasn't for that scooter, they would have been doing a taxi or a car trip in there. So I think we shouldn't underestimate the power of scooters as a disruptor for the standard go about your business and the car routine. So that's why I think that report's really important. The other thing I'll mention on the how is really kind of like micro mobility hubs or mobility hubs in general. It's the big craze in transport at the moment, and we haven't really got any in London in there. Maybe it's down to how we talk to buses and how we connect with different car operators in there. And certainly when it comes to the e-bikes in there, one of the big issues we've got is like the management of them. And for me, these hubs present a way to actually manage the parking of all these different vehicles and all these different options properly. So I'd point people in that direction. We really need to start rolling these things out. With that, I'll hand back over to Simon.
So I think it feels a bit weird. Ooh, jumping slides. It feels a bit weird for a London Cycling Campaign to be talking about car share and car hire and e-scooters and things like that. But I think the simple reality is if we don't start engaging on these issues, we face a London where the private motor car will still reign above all. London certainly is proving quite difficult for the market operators on this issue, both across car hire and car share and across e-bikes, and no doubt will be the same for e-scooters when they are legally allowed. So one of the issues is fragmentation. We're seeing that basically the London councils are working through a bylaw on bays where you can park e-bikes, for instance, in the future. But that at the moment, we're still facing a situation where every single operator in these markets has to negotiate across every single London borough. I don't know if any of you've hired a Lime or a Jumper or whatever, but you kind of get to the weird boundary somewhere halfway even through a borough sometimes, and suddenly you're banned from going any further, or you can't park it without a fine. This is having a massive impact. Now, on top of that, we've got the current crisis as well. So we're seeing these market operators come in, come out, doing all sorts of stuff. We need them to be able to have a stable operating platform in London. So that's really what the what and the when of this is all about, is we need a common framework, not just for bids to operate in London responsibly, but for where you could park e-scooters, e-bikes and e-cars, but also, and how you hire. So ideally, what we should be looking for is one common platform, data set that goes out to external apps, etc., so that you can hire easily, however you want to, wherever you want to, and get around in a more sensible way. We also want a situation, and this is the key ask really for this, for us, is we want to be in a situation where by 2024, Londoners live within 300 meters of a car share mobility hub with e-bike and e-scooter bay as well. So that means that you really are beginning to break the necessity to have those parked cars everywhere. They're parked 96% of the time in London. So we're giving a huge amount of real estate to private cars, and they cause a huge amount of congestion. If we can start to move Londoners away from that, we have a really good opportunity. The other thing we want is we want 10 shared mobility hubs, big transport interchange hubs with things like consolidation as well built in. So I think that covers shared mobility. I'm going to hand back to Brian now for smart road user charging.
Okay, thanks, Simon. So, yes, why should we charge people? Come on, click that slide on. There's a graph coming. Oh, hello. Yes, the graph on the left is the big one, really, in the whole document, really. And if you do find some time, have a look through it. We took it from a European Commission bit of research in there. And that column on the left is all the external costs of car use from the road in there. And the bottom colour of it is how much we actually recoup back from taxes. So there's an enormous amount that actually gets paid out of general taxation, or we have to recoup back from collisions, from environmental damage, from air quality impacts in there. All these other external costs are just being met by society at the moment. Totted up across Europe, this research at the moment saying £800 billion a year is the total cost for our reliance on automobility across Europe in there. And I recently spoke to a Director General at the EU Commission, because I get around somewhat, and he was saying it's actually closer to €1 trillion in there. So just let's let that figure sink in for a moment. But some earlier research from the University of Dresden pointed out that every inhabitant of the United Kingdom is subsidising car use to the tune of £800 a year. So that's every man, woman and child, whether they've got a car or not, is subsidising, because these things do so much damage on our roads. So going back to John's social justice point, is it fair that you're paying for other people's car use? And in London, where half the inhabitants don't own cars, that's something we really need to think about. So they need to start paying is the why. People need to pay for the damage they do. There's different ways of going about doing this one. I've referenced the Singapore system, which I think is quite good. So it's a distance-based road user charging. That might be one of the ways we want to go in London. At the moment, obviously, we have one fixed payment, which means you can drive around all day, irrespective of the damage that you're causing in there. So there might be some slightly new systems that we can look at in there. And we pass that over to the Mayor. Well, let's talk about the what now. Back over to you, Simon.
So we're going to rattle through these now, I think, because we want to make sure there's time for Q&A. Essentially, what we would need right now is a strategy. Then by 2024, what we need is trials, research, consultation, being ready to introduce smart road user charging across London. And at latest, by 2028, what we need is a London-wide version of smart road user charging. Even that might be too late. You know, we have now a new, very visceral demonstration of what is necessary journeys. So, you know, maybe this can be accelerated to look at this earlier. But really, it is, you know, it is vital that we do this to drive down private traffic. Right, back over to Brian.
Brilliant. Okay, I'll speed up as well. So yeah, low traffic neighbourhoods, it's a key part of it. For me, it's there's almost a big four involved in this one in there, but I'll leave that for a moment. In London, 15% of car trips are less than 1 kilometre in there, which is basically a 15-minute walk, which is coincidentally about the width that we like our low traffic neighbourhoods to be in theory in there. There's a little bit of a why. 60% of the car trips are less than 4 kilometres, which is like a 15-minute bike ride. So we pretty much can handle most of the transferring of trips over to walking and cycling if we can make a more pleasant surrounding for them. I've referenced some of the Waltham Forest stuff. It comes up a lot because we really did do quite a good monitoring job on this one in there. Just to highlight a few stats from the report that's on the left there, the nitrous oxides went down 15 to 25% as a result of the Mini Holland. Particulate matters particulate matter fell between 6 and 13% in there. And if you think about particulate matter, one tiny little toxic particle could bring on a heart attack in there. So these are big wins in there. They quantified that the residents of Waltham Forest altogether have another 41,000 life years in there. So that's 1.5 months for every single resident in there. Good stuff to know about. That's the kind of why. In terms of the how, there's a really excellent guide that I referenced on the slide there that London Cycling Campaign put together with Living Streets, and it's well worth a read. How to go next. I'll pass back over to Simon.
So thank you, Brian. Brian's work as well in Manchester with the B-Lines schemes is showing that now we are capable of dividing up cities and areas of cities very quickly into what the low traffic neighbourhood, the residential areas are, and what the main and distributor roads are. So we think that by 2021, next year, London, all London boroughs should be capable of mapping their entire boroughs for distributor roads and low traffic neighbourhoods. And indeed, many of them already are, we are learning. We also think that by 2021, TfL and the Mayor should mandate school streets and low traffic neighbourhoods for their funding streams, their local implementation plans or LIPs, and that therefore boroughs should then need to prepare a 3-year plan to do the low traffic neighbourhoods in their boroughs, and also to bring improvements to the distributor roads, because it's really important not to forget about those main roads. No road should be left behind, I think I've written here. And by 2028, we should then be in a position where we see no through motor traffic, no rat runs left in London. So thinking on to main roads now, Brian is going to tackle buses.
Yeah, buses are the big one really in transport terms, particularly in London. They're the ones that carry the most amount of people in there. Obviously, we want clean buses, which is why it's entitled zero emission buses in there. But I want to reference a little bit of the document in there. There's a TfL report there on what people want from their bus service, and it all comes down to reliability, really. People want to know that the bus is going to turn up and it's going to get them where they want to go in a reasonable amount of time in there. Why does that not happen? Well, the picture on the right kind of tells us, because there's so many unessential car trips going on there. There's evidence, and we reference in the report, that 3/4 of congestion is caused by excessive traffic use, and that's trips that didn't need to take place. So frankly, the way to make reliable buses, it all comes back to that same thing. Can we reduce cars? Is that the way to go about doing this? I'll pass back over to Simon.
So the simple answer here is we think that right now, indeed during this crisis, there is a real opportunity to review what's currently going on and plan for the next. There's a real issue with the Mayor's transport strategy came out. We were expecting to see a lot of bus and cycle only, high streets and bus lanes improving and stuff like that. We haven't seen that yet. So we think there is a real opportunity for bus priority measures, whether that's NPR camera, bus and cycle only streets, whether that's 24/7 bus lanes. We've still got the situation where there's bits of the TLRN, bits of the core road network for buses in London that have parking in the evenings and things like that. So we think there's a real opportunity to plan now for a much more robust core bus network, and that's the next year really. Also to look at how buses fit with on demand. We're seeing some trials, there needs to be more. If they're successful, they need to be rolled out, and we think by 2024 we have the real opportunity to create a core bus network that is much higher priority than is currently in London. We can also see bus only high streets by then, and at the same time the bus fleet obviously has to be overhauled. By 2024 we should see central London buses all being hybrid at least, ideally zero emissions, and by 2030 we think, really 2032 I think we've written in the report, all buses should be completely zero emissions. Back to Brian for low carbon freight.
Yeah, really one of the most effective things we could do to reduce carbon is to make our freight zero emission. That's like the big one really. There's been a lot of focus on cars, but really it's freight that matters the most. And I'll tell you why. In London, we've got 250,000 lorries coming into London every day, and it accounts for 23% of the CO2 in there. So you can see the potential market in there. And what can we do about it? Kimberly Clark and Kellogg's collaborated on a because a lot of freight goes around half empty or quarter empty, and they consolidated their trips together and saved 433,000 vehicle kilometres in just 1 year, and they're getting annual results like that in there. Another thing we can do, looking at it, is the ultra low emissions zone. In the first 6 months, that reduced CO2 in central London by 4% in there. So the answer is, seems a little bit simple. Can we extend that? And I'll pass you over to Simon to see if we can.
So freight is, I think, the greatest level of unknowns, the toughest nut to crack. The pathway for vehicles to kind of hydrogen or electric is far from clear. So what can we do? Right now, we can strengthen the freight and servicing action plan. That isn't currently updated to reflect a 2030 target. We need really good scrappage deals. We need the industry to be very clear on where their pathway for vehicle replacement is. We need EV charging delivery and planning for that. And we need area plans. And this goes back to Brian's point. There is a huge elasticity in terms of freight, servicing, consolidation, in terms of the number of vehicle movements made. So the vehicle pathway to electric or to zero carbon may be very, very difficult at the moment. But actually, the number of vehicle movements and how quickly we can drive down those vehicle movements is the key, I think, here. So there is a bunch of stuff in terms of ensuring that the London Assembly, the Mayor, TfL, enable the creation of consolidation mega hubs out on the outskirts of London and local distribution points. That's the key, really, to driving down movements as well as vehicle changes. Over to Brian for low carbon vehicles in general.
Okay, so the actual zero emission cars only made it to number 7 on our list, and we hope that the government starts thinking in these terms as well. So really the picture was said by Fran at the start of the talk, really. It's about reducing the amount of cars. It's not about necessarily buying a new car, your electric one, to go about your daily business with in there, but keeping the diesel one for the weekends. This is consumerism might not be the correct answer on this one, particularly as it's been reported there's a big battery bottleneck, particularly when it comes to lithium ion batteries. I don't know whether you've been following it, but like if you need cobalt for these batteries, and that's in one like a child slave labor camp in the Congo that you get all this stuff, it mightn't be the thing that we want to pin all our hopes on in there. So really we're talking about a reduction of private vehicles of 20,000 a week, and that should already have started, and that's across the UK, that figure in there. What can we do about it? Well, clean taxi fleets are really important in there, and really the smart road user charging comes in there as well in terms of the how, but I'll pass over to Simon now.
So I think the main thing, the report has recommendations about 2024 for getting rid of petrol, diesel taxis and private hire in central London, and by 2030 indeed getting rid of essentially motor vehicles that aren't electric on our roads. But the key one here is to start to question the need for cars in that sense at all. This is a QuiCab, and we know that there are some operators trying to get these over to the UK. There are really opportunities from now pretty much to create scrappage schemes that don't just look at electric cars, but also e-bikes, shared mobility, public transport credits, etc. So that's the big key, is to start to question, as we move away from petrol and diesel, do we move away from cars as well? Back over to Brian for the last couple of slides.
Okay, so it's last but definitely not least here, car-free planning. It's a big one, and I referenced the London plan there. Just if you look at the bottom of that table in there, you can see it's still possible to build a house in London and get 1.5 spaces for cars associated with it. We're pretty far off having car-free development in there. You'll see it references PTAL in there, so basically it's saying the public transport accessibility level's low, so we'll allow them to have a car. Well, no one's going to be able to put a bus service on if everybody's using cars. It's creating a kind of vicious circle that we need to find our way out of it. So I think we need to do something about that. So and repeat after me, it's got to be car-free development everywhere. And I'll pass over to Simon to finish off.
So how do we do car-free development? This is Marmalade Lane in Cambridge, by the way, which actually isn't car-free, despite the fact that it looks it. There's a couple of car parking spaces on the outskirts, but it looks nice, so that's why I put it in there. So as Brian talked about PTAL, and the current system is to say, basically, if you've got a very low PTAL, if you're far from a bus route or a public transport hub, hub, then oh, you can put the cars in. And we're proposing something else instead, which is climate safe modes accessibility, CSMA, which is kind of hinted at in a sense in the Mayor's transport strategy. But the idea is, instead of saying, well, it's a low P-tail, therefore we should just accept cars, the answer should be, it's a low P-tail, so let's build sustainable transport routes to this housing that's going to be located, whether that's bus improvements or shared mobility hubs, or whether that's cycle routes or whatever. But we should enable car-free living across the whole of outer London as well as inner London. So that wraps up the 8 key recommendations, and I think we finish on this little timeline of where they all sit between now and 2030. And I think it's over to questions.
Thanks very much, Simon and Brian. Yeah, I think that last slide pretty much provides a template for what we must be doing. So yeah, the message is clear. Download the report, the Climate Safe Streets report, read it and share it with colleagues and share it far and wide. I did forget to mention early on in the broadcast, for those of you who are watching and have downloaded the software, there is a handout section within the control panel where you can actually download the report as a PDF. And if you can't download it from there, you'll be able to grab it from the LCC website and elsewhere, I'm sure. So we should kick off with the Q&A. We've probably got about 10-15 minutes. Now, panelists did say that they would be happy to take questions after the session, so we'll find a way of doing that in a kind of live forum, perhaps Twitter or LinkedIn or somewhere else. And to kick things off straight away, I've got a question here from Anna Semlin from 20's Plenty. How can we best empower politicians to be more radical and act more quickly? I'll hand that over to Fran in the first case, and then maybe John, Simon and Brian can follow on afterwards.
Hi, yes. So I think it's a really good question, and it's one of the things that we were hoping to do with our campaign in the run up to the election. It's why elections are such a key point for us, because we can demonstrate the breadth of support for calls like this, which was the plan. I think there's also a way we can back up the politicians. So, you know, we have a wealth of evidence that shows that this is the way that needs to be done. I think there is a way, as John was talking about bringing people along around the positive message that we're talking about. You know, the London we could create if we follow this plan in 2030 is a better London than the one we're in at the moment. But I think we also have to empower politicians to think about the silent majority and, you know, show some leadership around this as well. You know, this is something that they need to step up and say, this is where we need to go and this is where we need to do. So I will take on board feedback, I will take on board thoughts, but we can't keep doing what we're doing at the moment. We have to change what we're doing.
And I think, thanks, Fran, I think for me, it comes back to the heart of this is why we had so many people declare climate emergency and then do nothing about it. It's the right thing to do. There's an easy recognition about that from politicians, but they just get really scared about taking decisions that seem to squeeze at the movement by car. And they're very familiar with the kind of pictures and interaction that I showed earlier with cross people with their arms folded. And I think that, and for me, that's like, well, of course, some people will say that, but they, A, are a majority, and B, we have to show, and this is, I think, a real opportunity. It's not that we have to show that this is better for everybody. It's actually get used to that. Let's explore with our politicians why, in addition to this, the climate imperative, it's good for this reason, for that reason, for everything. It ticks so many of your policy boxes. And therefore, in the context of that, you should see opposition to some of these things. You should place it appropriately. A, know that it's a minority, a really small minority in many cases, and B, place that against a basket of other priorities that you are committed to pursuing. That's it for me, as it were, just to get the politicians away from the fear, the instinctive fear that they have of the visceral reaction of the minority.
Thanks, John. Simon and Brian, would you like to come in on that question as well?
I mean, I think for me, Fran has covered it very well. I think the simple answer is that politicians need to feel the pressure to change. They need to hear from the public to change, and that's really important. But I think also, you know, as a campaigner, one of the dark and sinister secrets of my job really is to make sure that the politicians hear stuff that they care about. So it's about making sure that they understand why this is such an important issue, and why inaction isn't okay, and why action is okay. So I think that's the key for me.
Just all I'd add is a couple of sound bites, really. They definitely can't do too much on this topic at the moment, but they can definitely do too little when it comes to politicians in there. So that will be on them for future generations. And the longer we leave it, the more bolder the interventions will be. This plan's quite reasonable at the moment, but we're talking in 10, 15, 20 years time, if we haven't done anything, if we haven't started to do anything, and the actual actions will be very radical, and we'll have a much severer political splashback on them. So go now, get at the front of the queue and start getting the benefits in there, and it could be good for the economy and good for the people in there. But if you leave it and you leave it and you leave it, it's a terrible decision to come down the line.
Thank you. Just a question, given the current situation around the world with coronavirus, I mean, is there any thoughts on how we can, as an industry, kind of lock in some of the benefits of, you know, reduced congestion and better air quality? I mean, it's possibly one of the strangest social experiments in terms of a forced behaviour change experiment. So is there any thoughts on how we can maybe lock in some of the benefits at the moment?
Can I come in first? It's Brian again. Really, one of the positives about this crisis at the moment is we're all getting a taste of what like a car-free living's like wherever we are. I'm in a very high car dependency area, yet when I go out for the hourly walk with the kids every day, it's people cycling down the middle of the road, everybody's walking around, you can hear everything. It's like a good clean air in there. So I'm hoping we've got that memory now, and it's not like it that we have to send people over to Utrecht to get a taste of what it could be like. We're all having a little taste in there. I'm hoping when we come out the other end, we won't want to go back and fill up our streets with cars and make it hostile again. So that's a real positive we can take away, that we're all getting an experience of what the city should be like.
I was going to jump in and say, fairly obviously, London Cycling Campaign, we're already talking to TfL and the Mayor about kind of what's happening in the short term, you know, and in the medium term and in the long term, and we're aiming to put out something about that fairly soon. I think it is really important to understand that while on one hand that we're not going to go back, you know, that there is a whole bunch of stuff that's going to change now, forever probably. But on the other side of the coin, we're also going to be in a situation where a lot of things will just go back if we're not very careful. You know, a lot of the traffic will just return. We're seeing rising traffic levels over the last few days in London. So we have to be very careful about how we think about this, how we move forward, and what we return to. You know, I think there's a lot of thought going on about that one, but not a lot of, we're not quite there yet.
Yeah, I'd just chip in as well and say, like, obviously, the situation that's brought this about is not good. Like the massive societal lockdown is not the, you know, we've got quieter streets and we've got more people cycling, but you know, this isn't the vision of London in 2030 that we want to see. We want to see people moving about, going to the shops, going to work, doing their daily journeys. We just want to, the vision for 2030, where we want to be, is very different from where we are right now. But what we are seeing now is behaviour change shift on quite a radical scale. So people who haven't cycled before are pulling their bikes out of their sheds and using that as either their socially distanced way of getting to their essential job, or a socially distanced way of getting the exercise that they're missing at the moment through the lockdown. So, you know, we've got an opportunity now with the range of people who are rediscovering and refinding cycling at the moment. And I think the key thing coming out of this is making sure that those people don't then lose that opportunity that they're taking at the moment to use their bikes. We want to enable everyone who has picked up their bike during this time to keep using their bike, and that's going to be the key challenge for the boroughs and the mayor. Just to say, while I've got everyone here, obviously for people who are doing that, LCC have put out a cycling advice line at the moment, which might be of interest for some people. It's for people who are returning to cycling or getting on their bikes again. It's just loads of tips and advice on how to do that. So I just thought I'd give that a quick plug.
Thanks very much, Fran. So yeah, it's 11:30, so we'll probably wrap up now. A huge thanks to the London Cycling Campaign for making today's webcast possible. Thanks to all our speakers and everyone who's logged in to watch, listen and contribute to the discussion.